The streetlights on Mercer Boulevard had just flickered on when Dr. Renata Holloway pulled out of Vantage Medical Center's parking structure and headed south toward home. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind where the air smells like wet leaves and exhaust, where the sky shifts from bruised purple to full dark in under 20 minutes. Renata had been on her feet since 6 that morning, 11 hours of back-to-back patient consultations, 2 emergency referrals, and a department budget meeting that somehow stretched across her lunch break. She was tired in the deep, cellular way that only physicians who care too much understand. Her car, a charcoal-colored Lexus ES, moved quietly through the intersection at Brentwood and 5th. She had the heat on low. The radio was off. She was thinking about nothing in particular, whether she'd remembered to set her coffee maker on a timer, whether the dry cleaning she'd dropped off Thursday was still waiting for her, when the black and white cruiser swung out from the side street without signaling and clipped her rear quarter panel with a sound like a gunshot. The impact wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't meant to be. But it was deliberate. Anyone watching from the sidewalk, and 3 people could see it. The cruiser had room to stop, room to yield. Instead, it accelerated slightly just before contact, as if testing something, as if the driver wanted to see what would happen when metal met metal at low speed on a quiet city block. Renata's car spun half a rotation and came to rest against the curb. The rear bumper crumpled. One tail light shattered. She sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel, breathing slowly. Then she reached into her center console, retrieved her phone, and pressed record. Officer Dale Pruitt stepped out of his cruiser with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been told he was wrong. He was 38, sandy-haired, with the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic in his early 20s and hadn't done much about it since. He adjusted his belt as he walked, looked at the damage on her car with an expression closer to boredom than concern, and then looked at Renata, license and registration. He said, "Not, are you okay? Not, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you." Just those 3 words, delivered with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. Renata stepped out of her car calmly. She was wearing charcoal slacks and a deep burgundy blazer. Her ID badge from Vantage Medical still clipped to her lapel. She set her phone on the roof of the Lexus camera still running, angled toward Pruitt, and reached into her bag for her wallet. "Your vehicle struck mine," she said, evenly, factually. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm." "I am calm," she said. "I'd like your badge number, please." Something shifted behind Pruitt's eyes. A flicker of annoyance. Maybe of surprise. He wasn't used to this. Most people in his experience, and his experience was wide in the narrow way of someone who has patrolled the same 6 neighborhoods for 11 years. Most people got nervous. They apologized. They looked at the ground. Renata Holloway was looking directly at him. "Badge number," she said again. "I'll be asking the questions here," Pruitt said. He stepped closer. Not close enough to be threatening in any way, a camera could easily capture, but close enough to signal something. "Were you drinking this evening?" "No." "Where are you coming from?" "Work." "And where do you work?" She paused for exactly 1 beat. "Vantage Medical Center. I'm a cardiologist. I've been there since 6 this morning." She glanced toward her badge, then back at him. "Your front bumper struck my rear quarter panel while you were pulling out of a side street. I have footage of the intersection from a business camera directly behind us. And I'm currently recording this conversation. I'd like your badge number. And I'd like to file an incident report." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "You don't need to be recording anything. I'm legally permitted to record this interaction in this state," she said. "Badge number, please." He gave it to her, reluctantly, like a man handing over something he expected to get back. What happened in the next 4 minutes would later be described by witnesses, by a city council member, and eventually by a federal oversight board. As one of the most brazen examples of escalation without justification they had reviewed in recent years. Pruitt called for backup. He claimed, on the radio, that he had a non-compliant suspect at Brentwood, and fifth, he told dispatch the driver was erratic and possibly impaired. He said these things while Renata stood 5 feet away from him, with her hands visible and her voice completely level. She heard every word. She didn't flinch. The first backup unit arrived in under 3 minutes, a cruiser piloted by Officer Wendy Ochoa, who pulled up, assessed the scene in approximately 4 seconds, and immediately looked confused. What she saw was a woman in professional attire standing calmly beside a damaged vehicle, while her colleague, red-faced, slightly breathless, stood on the opposite side of the car, speaking into his radio with increasing urgency. Ochoa got out of her car slowly. "Dale," she said. "What's the situation?" "Non-compliant," he said again. The words seemed to be doing a lot of work for him. Renata turned toward Officer Ochoa. "Good evening. My name is Dr. Renata Holloway. Officer Pruitt's vehicle struck mine approximately 8 minutes ago at this intersection. I've been attempting to file an incident report and request his badge number. I have video documentation of the collision and of this conversation." Ochoa looked at Renata, then at Dale, then at the damage on the Lexus, then back at Dale. "Dale," she said quietly. "Don't," he said. What neither of them knew yet, what no one on that street corner knew yet, was what was already in motion, 3 blocks away and 14 floors up. Inside the offices of the Whitmore County District Attorney, Dr. Renata Holloway was not simply a cardiologist at Vantage Medical Center. She was the founding director of the center's Cardiovascular Equity Initiative, a program that had treated over 4,000 uninsured patients in the past 6 years. She sat on the board of the Whitmore County Health Commission. She was the recipient of the Governor's Public Health Medal twice, and for the past 18 months, she had been serving, quietly and without public announcement, as the chief medical consultant to a joint FBI-DOJ task force investigating systemic civil rights violations within the Whitmore County Police Department. The task force had been watching Officer Dale Pruitt for 7 of those 18 months, not because he was the worst officer in the department, because he was, in the language of the investigation, representative, a data point in a pattern, a man whose record included 14 use-of-force complaints in 11 years, of which 0 had resulted in disciplinary action, a man whose dashcam had experienced technical failures on 6 separate occasions that coincided neatly with complaints, a man who, according to 3 former colleagues who had agreed to cooperate with investigators, had a habit of what they called tapping, making minor contact with civilian vehicles he deemed suspicious as a pretext for stops he couldn't otherwise legally justify. 7 months of documentation. 7 months of collected testimony. Cross-referenced incident reports. Recovered footage from city cameras and private businesses. 7 months of building a case that investigators believed was finally, almost, ready. Tumben Dale Pruitt drove his cruiser into the rear quarter panel of the task force's chief medical consultant on a Tuesday evening in October. The call that went out from Whitmore County DA's office at 7:47 p.m. was not a 911 call. It was a direct line to the regional FBI field office, routed through a deputy who had the number memorized. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. The decision took less. Renata's phone, still recording, picked up the sound of the first vehicle, arriving at 7:52 p.m. Not a police cruiser. An SUV. Dark blue. No markings. That parked half a block north and did not immediately produce any occupants. Then another. Then a third. Officer Ochoa noticed them first. She turned slowly, scanning the street, and what she saw made her put one hand on the doorframe of her cruiser as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Because the vehicles kept coming, not rushing, not with sirens just arriving, one after another, with the calm inevitability of something that had been planned for a long time and was now simply executing. 11 vehicles in total. 3 of them armored. Federal plates. The agents who stepped out wore vests that said FBI across the back in letters large enough to read from half a block away. 2 of them carried tablets. Several carried folders. All of them moved with the specific, unhurried precision of people who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they were doing when they got there. Dale Pruitt turned around and saw them. And for the first time since he'd stepped out of his cruiser 22 minutes earlier, he had nothing to say. One of the agents, a tall woman with close-cropped natural hair and a visitor badge clipped to her vest, walked directly to Renata. "Dr. Holloway," she said. "Are you injured?" "No," Renata said. "We're going to need your vehicle documented before it's moved." She looked briefly at the crumpled bumper. Then she turned to Officer Ochoa. "Who's the senior officer on scene?" Ochoa pointed at Pruitt. The agent nodded once. She walked to Pruitt. She introduced herself, Special Agent Dana Merritt, Civil Rights Division, and she told him, in a voice that carried clearly across the evening air, that he was being detained pending investigation into potential federal civil rights violations, obstruction, and falsification of an official police radio transmission. Pruitt's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I want my union rep," he said. "You'll have access to representation." Agent Merritt said, "Right now I need you to step away from this vehicle." The 3 people who had watched the collision from the sidewalk were still there. They had been joined by perhaps 15 others residents, a couple walking a dog, a delivery driver who had parked and simply stood on the corner with his phone raised. They watched in almost total silence as a 12-year veteran of the Whitmore County Police Department was guided, with careful professionalism and no drama whatsoever, toward a federal vehicle. Renata Holloway stood beside her damaged car and watched too. Her phone was still recording. She reached up, finally, and stopped it. The story broke the next morning. Not through a press release, those would come later, but through the footage. 3 separate angles. The business camera Renata had mentioned, the dashcam from Officer Ochoa's cruiser, and Renata's own phone recording. Someone at the DA's office, no one ever confirmed, who shared a portion of the phone footage with a local journalist at 11 p.m. on Tuesday night. By Wednesday at 6 a.m., it had been viewed 400,000 times. By noon, it was national. The footage showed everything. The approach of Pruitt's cruiser, the slight acceleration before impact, Renata stepping out, composed, badge visible, the request for a badge number, the false radio transmission, that part was in the audio. Clear as anything non-compliant suspect, possibly impaired, delivered, while she stood perfectly still with her hands at her sides. And then, eventually, the arrival of the federal vehicles, one after another, until the block looked like the staging ground for something significant, because it was. The Whitmore County Police Department issued a statement Wednesday afternoon expressing its commitment to a full and transparent review. The statement did not mention Officer Pruitt by name. A second statement, 3 hours later, announced that Officer Pruitt had been placed on administrative leave. A third statement, issued Thursday morning, corrected the record. Pruitt had been suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The department's union chapter released their own statement Wednesday evening, which used the phrases due process and rush to judgment a combined 7 times. It was widely shared in some corners of the internet and widely criticized in others. DA Sylvia Park held a press conference Thursday at noon. She stood at a podium in a navy blazer and spoke for 11 minutes without notes. And what she said calmly, precisely, with the particular weight of someone who has been building toward a moment for a long time, was that the incident on Brentwood and 5th was not an isolated event. That it was, in fact, the most recent and most visible link in a chain of documented conduct that the DA's office and federal investigators had been tracking for the better part of 2 years. That the investigation was now entering a new phase, that additional officers might be named, that certain supervisory personnel within the department were also under review. She did not take questions. Dr. Renata Holloway gave one interview in the days that followed. Not to a national outlet, though she received requests from all of them. She gave it to a small community newspaper in the Eastbrook neighborhood, the part of Whitmore County where she had grown up, where her mother still lived, where the clinic she'd co-founded 7 years ago still operated every Saturday morning out of a converted storefront on Caldwell Street. The interviewer was a 23-year-old named Marcus, who had interned at the paper since his sophomore year of college and was, by all accounts, absolutely terrified to be sitting across from her. He asked her how she was feeling. She smiled, the kind of smile that is not performative, but genuine, and said she was tired. Mostly, she said the whole thing had been frightening in the moment, in a way she hadn't fully processed until she got home and sat down in her kitchen and realized her hands were shaking. She said she was grateful for the witnesses, for the cameras, for Agent Merritt and her team, who had been professional throughout. She said she thought a lot about all the people who'd experienced something similar and hadn't had video, hadn't had the specific combination of circumstances that made the footage land the way it did. She said she hoped it mattered. Marcus asked if she was angry. She thought about it for a long moment. "I'm something," she said finally. "I don't know if angry is the right word. Angry suggests I'm surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm insistent. Maybe. I've been insistent for a long time. I'll keep being insistent." She drove herself home from the interview in a rental car. Because her Lexus was still being held as evidence, the federal investigation into the Whitmore County Police Department was unsealed in its preliminary findings 6 weeks after the incident on Brentwood, and fifth, the report was 340 pages. It documented a pattern of racially disparate traffic stops going back 9 years. It identified a practice of informal coordination among certain officers to produce parallel records that would survive internal review. It named 14 officers by badge number and 4 supervisory personnel who had either participated in or been aware of the pattern. Dale Pruitt was listed first. Not because his case was the most severe, it wasn't necessarily, but because his incident had the best documentation. Because 3 witnesses had been standing on a sidewalk when he made contact with a woman's car. Because the radio transmission had been captured. Because the woman he had chosen, on a Tuesday evening in late October, happened to be someone who had spent 18 months helping federal investigators build the case that would eventually be used against him. No one in the task force ever said officially that there was something poetic about that. But more than one person said it privately. The departmental hearings began in January. Pruitt's union representation argued, predictably, that the collision had been accidental, a failure of visibility, a tight corner, a moment of inattention that any driver might experience. They argued the radio transmission had been a miscommunication, a stress réponse, a mischaracterization of a situation that was admittedly confusing in the moment. The video made these arguments very difficult. Pruitt testified on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room on the 6th floor of the Whitmore County Justice Center. He was accompanied by 2 attorneys and a union representative who took notes throughout. He answered most questions with some variation of, "to the best of my recollection, and I don't recall that specific detail." When asked about the acceleration captured on the business camera in the 2 seconds before impact, he said he didn't recall increasing his speed. When asked why he had described Dr. Holloway as possibly impaired on the radio, he said he'd had concerns about her behavior. The hearing examiner asked him to describe specifically which behaviors had concerned him. He said she had seemed agitated. The hearing examiner noted for the record that 3 independent witnesses, the dashcam footage from Officer Ochoa's unit, and Renata's own phone recording all documented Dr. Holloway as calm, composed, and stationary throughout the interaction. Pruitt said he recalled it differently. He was terminated in March, The formal letter cited, among other things, conduct unbecoming an officer, falsification of official communications, and a documented history of use of force complaints that the department's review board determined had been inadequately investigated at the time of filing. The union filed a grievance. The grievance was denied. The union appealed. The appeal was still pending as of the following autumn. 3 of the other named officers negotiated agreements with investigators over the spring and summer. 2 retired early. Several supervisory personnel, facing separate administrative proceedings, also stepped down. The department hired a reform consultant, a woman from Minneapolis, who had done similar work in 4 other cities, and announced a new policy framework for use of force reporting, dashcam maintenance, and complaint review. Whether the policies would hold, whether the culture would shift, whether the next version of Dale Pruitt would encounter the same chain of consequences, these were questions that no press release could answer. They were questions that reporters asked, that community advocates asked, that residents of Eastbrook and every neighborhood like it asked, in the persistent, unglamorous way of people who have learned not to trust that a single visible reckoning means the work is done. Renata got her car back in December. The repair bill came to $4. 300 new rear bumper, new taillight assembly, alignment, adjustment, paint matching. She sent the invoice to the county attorney's office, which had already indicated that the city would cover costs related to the incident. She went back to work the Wednesday, after the story broke. The same way she'd gone to work every other Wednesday for the past 11 years early, before the building was fully awake, parking in her usual spot in the structure on the east side of Vantage Medical, taking the elevator to the 4th floor, stopping for coffee from the cart near the cardiology suite, checking her messages before the first appointment of the day. Colleagues stopped by her office more than usual that week. Some of them knocked. Some of them just leaned in the doorway and said her name, and then didn't seem to know what to say next. She was patient with all of them. She thanked them for checking in. She said she was fine. She said she had patients to see. A few of her patients mentioned it. An older gentleman named she would not say his name publicly, but she mentioned him in the Marcus interview, who came in for a follow-up on a stent procedure, who had grown up in Eastbrook just like she had, who sat across from her in the examination room and looked at her for a long moment, and then said, quietly, "You didn't back down. It wasn't a question." "No." She said. "Good." He said. She took his blood pressure. She reviewed his results. She told him his numbers were excellent. She told him to keep up whatever he was doing. He thanked her, put his jacket back on, and walked out to schedule his next appointment. She sat in the examination room for a moment, after he left, alone with the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of the hospital doing what hospitals do. Then she picked up the next chart, and she went to work. 11 armored vehicles on a Tuesday evening in October. That was the image that stayed with people. That was the screenshot that circulated. The still frame that ended up on magazine websites, and in op-eds, and in a political science professor's slide deck about the intersection of institutional accountability and individual persistence. But here is what that image didn't show, and what no camera had caught. The 11 months before that evening when Renata had sat in conference rooms reviewing case files, cross-referencing complaint records, helping federal attorneys understand the clinical language in medical testimony from people who had been injured in the field. The early mornings, the late calls, the careful, unglamorous work of building something that might actually hold. The 11 vehicles didn't arrive because of luck. They didn't arrive because of fate. They arrived because a woman had spent a year and a half doing a job most people don't know exists. And because she had done it well enough that when an officer drove his cruiser into her rear bumper on a Tuesday evening, the people whose job it was to respond already knew his name, already had his file, and were already, in the language of federal procedure, in a position to act. She was just driving home. She had been building something for 18 months, and on a Tuesday evening, on Brentwood and 5th, those two facts met each other. The rest, the footage, the headlines, the hearings. The termination was what happened when they did.